Nobody on the 52nd floor noticed the poor single dad mopping the hallway that night. Outside, snow fell in thick silence, burying Chicago in white. Inside, a system worth $400 million was collapsing, and an entire engineering team had already given up. But the man in worn gray coveralls stopped. He didn't call anyone. He didn't panic. He just looked and understood. 4 minutes later, the system came back to life. By morning, the CEO would replay the footage 3 times and ask a question that would shake the entire company. Who is the cleaning guy? The building had a way of making you feel small. 63 floors of steel and glass rising out of the South Loop. Novagrid systems occupied the top 22 of them. At street level, the lobby felt like the inside of a glacier white marble, cold lighting. Security desks, staffed by men who never smiled. The revolving doors exhaled warm air onto the sidewalk and drew it back in again. A steady mechanical breathing that made the building feel alive in a way its architects probably hadn't intended. By the time the elevator reached the 52nd floor, you were high enough to see the curve of the lake through the windows, the orange smear of the highway, the city blinking against a sky that had been threatening snow for 3 days. On December 14th, it finally arrived. The flakes came in slow and thick, the kind that settled rather than blew, accumulating on window ledges and the flat roofs of shorter buildings below. From the street, it was the sort of snowfall that made people slow down, look up, feel briefly reminded of something. From the 52nd floor, it was just darkness turning white. Daniel Hayes pushed his mop cart off the service elevator at 11:47 p.m. He wore gray coveralls, size large, with a small tear at the left shoulder that he'd been meaning to patch for 2 weeks. His boots were steel-toed and old, the leather cracked at the toe box, the right heel worn down at a slight angle from the way he walked. He was 38 years old and looked at not aged badly, just the way men who've carried real weight look. A certain gravity around the eyes, a stillness in how they moved through a room. He was not the kind of person who filled silence. He was the kind of person who let silence be what it was. He worked from south to north, the way his supervisor had trained him the first week. Bathrooms first, then the break room, which on the engineering floors was never fully clean because engineers left mugs and printed pages and half-eaten food in a way that seemed to communicate they considered the break room an extension of their desks. Then the long central corridor where the engineering pods were arranged in clusters of 4 desks each, most of them dark at this hour. A few still glowing with laptop screens left on screensavers cycling lazily, or documents left open by engineers who intended to come back and never did. He'd been doing this for 4 months. He'd learned the rhythm of the floor, which pods stayed lit until 10 p.m., which engineers left coffee cups that needed washing, which sections of floor were trafficked enough to need mopping twice, and which were decorative at this point. He knew the night security guard's rounds by the sound of his shoes on the marble and the time between passes. He knew a lot, working quietly through other people's spaces. He just didn't say any of it. The corridor outside Lab 7C was different tonight. The door was shut, but the light inside burned white hot, the kind of fluorescent brightness that meant people had been there for hours, pushing through on caffeine, and the specific stubbornness of people who believed that being present was the same as making progress. Daniel could hear it before he saw it. Not voices exactly. It was too late for voices, but the low hum of servers pushing hard. Harder than cooling fans usually ran at this hour, and underneath that, something off in the pattern. A sound that wasn't wrong in any describable way, but was wrong in the way that a note held too long becomes wrong. Sustain without resolution. He'd heard that sound before. In a different building. In a different life. He kept mopping. The break room was 40 feet past Lab 7C. He filled his bucket, changed the mop head, started back the way he'd come. And as he passed the lab again, he let himself look at the wall. The board on the wall outside Lab 7C was a monitoring display, a 6.5-inch panel mounted at eye level, showing a simplified status tree for the Helios system. It was the kind of display put in corridors for management walkthroughs, a visual summary, nothing technically detailed, the sort of thing designed to let someone ask, "Is it working?" and get a color-coded answer without having to understand what the colors meant. Daniel understood what the colors meant. He'd read about Helios 3 months ago, during a 2 a.m. break when the building was quiet, and the CTO's office door had been left open, and there was a whiteboard visible from the corridor, with the system architecture sketched on it, half erased, still legible. He'd stood in the doorway long enough to read it, and then he'd gone back to mopping, and spent the rest of the shift turning the architecture over in his head, the way he used to turn things over in his head when he had the right to think about them professionally. Old habits. The status tree was red, not the soft orange red of a warning, the full arterial red of a critical failure, with 3 separate subsystems showing fault codes across the right side of the display, and a 4th caught in a restart sequence that kept dying at 67% completion. The progress bar would fill 2/3 of the way, stall, and reset. Fill, stall, reset. Like a man trying to climb a wall who couldn't get his elbow over the top, sliding back to the ground each time with the same trajectory, the same result. Daniel stopped mopping. He looked at the board for 9 seconds. He counted them the way he counted things, when precision mattered. Not in words, just in breath. 1 breath, 2 breaths, 3. On the 4th breath, he shifted his attention to the secondary terminal mounted beside the board. It was a small panel, 12 inches wide, the kind of read-only diagnostic display that facilities management teams use to check whether HVAC operations were interfering with server cooling loads. Most people who walked by it every day had never considered it anything more than that. The icon grid in the lower left corner showed process timestamps. Active processes, in order of most recent execution, with their microsecond stamps in a small gray font. Most of the rows were unremarkable, but between 2 of them specifically, between the monitoring subsystem's primary output log and the system's event acknowledgement process, there was a gap. 17 milliseconds. It would be invisible to most people looking at it. It was invisible even to most engineers, in the way that small things become invisible when you've been staring at the large things for 72 hours. But Daniel saw it the way you see a crack in a wall once you've seen it immediately, permanently, unable to unsee it. In a distributed load balancing model, the monitoring feed and the event acknowledgement process needed to be synchronized to within a few milliseconds. When they fell out of sync, when the monitoring log got ahead of the acknowledgement process, even briefly the system's central logic entered a state of interpretive uncertainty. It had 2 slightly different pictures of its own condition, and rather than accepting the discrepancy, it restarted the reporting process to try to reconcile them, which introduced the same desync, which triggered the restart again. The system wasn't failing. It was arguing with itself about what it saw. Daniel stood at the terminal for a moment. He did not have administrator access to Helios. He had facilities access, which meant he could check cooling parameters and submit service requests. He could not touch the code base. He could not deploy anything, but the read-only terminal had a display filter function, designed for sorting which process data was shown on the corridor board, and the filter function, when applied, ran briefly through the same buffer that the looping subprocess was checking against. It wouldn't fix the desync, but it would interrupt the feedback loop at the right moment, giving the restart sequence a clean window, a few hundred milliseconds, without conflicting input to complete the 67% stall point and finish its cycle. He typed 2 characters. The filter applied. The terminal's display flickered slightly as it redirected output. Behind the wall, in the server room, a process that had been dying at 67% for 72 hours found a gap of silence in its confirmation loop and completed. The board went from red to amber. He watched it for a moment. Amber meant the system was still assessing, still running its recovery checks. It would stay amber until all 4 subsystems confirmed stable states. That could take a few minutes. He picked up the mop. He was 40 feet down the corridor when the board turned green. He heard the faint change in the fan pitch behind the wall, the servers backing down from full load. Cooling normalized. The sound of a machine that had remembered what it was for. He didn't look back. He finished the corridor at 1:15 a.m., returned his equipment to the service closet, took the elevator to the parking structure, and drove 45 minutes through falling snow to a 2-bedroom apartment in Bridgeport, where a 7-year-old girl named Sophie was asleep under a blanket with cartoon foxes on it. Her small sneakers were by the door, toes pointing out the way they always did. There was a drawing on the kitchen table, half finished, a crayon rendering of what appeared to be a spaceship or possibly a large hat. He stood in the doorway of her room for a moment, the way he did most nights. Then he went to bed. He didn't tell anyone what he'd done. He'd weighed it briefly, standing in the corridor, and set it aside. He had no proof of what he'd understood. He had no formal standing here. He was the cleaning man on the 52nd floor. And the gap between what he knew and what anyone would believe about what he knew was exactly the width of his coveralls, the worn-down heel of his right boot, and 4 months of quiet work in other people's spaces. He didn't think anyone would understand. He was wrong about that. There's a version of Daniel Hayes's life that reads like a straight line. He grew up in Rockford, Illinois, the second of 3 kids, the one who took things apart. Not to break them, to understand them. His mother kept finding her appliances disassembled and carefully reassembled. Everything working the way it was supposed to, except now with the casing cracked open and small handwritten labels stuck to the internal components. This makes it warm. This makes it spin. This is what breaks first. He earned a full scholarship to the University of Illinois, studied computer engineering, graduated 3rd in his class. His thesis on distributed load balancing in smart grid architecture was cited in a patent filing 4 years later. He didn't know that until someone told him at a conference in 2019, and he'd smiled in a way that embarrassed him, the way unexpected pride always did. He joined Apex Dynamics in 2011, a mid-sized firm out of Denver that was doing genuinely interesting work in AI-managed power infrastructure. By 2016, he was lead systems engineer, managing a team of 9, responsible for 3 active client deployments and 1 major R&D build. He was 32. He was good at his job, in the particular way that meant other people trusted him, without fully understanding why. He met Emma at a company retreat in Estes Park in 2014. She was in logistics, methodical and dry-humored, the kind of person who remembered the names of strangers' children and kept a small notebook where she wrote down things she wanted to remember. They married in 2016. Sophie was born in 2017, healthy and loud and inexplicably fascinated by ceiling fans from the age of 3 months. Then Emma got sick. The word sick doesn't carry the weight of what actually happened. She was diagnosed with an aggressive form of lymphoma in October 2019. By March 2021, she was gone. Sophie was 3 years old and did not fully understand what gone meant, only that her mother's side of the bed was always cold now, and her father sometimes stood in doorways doing nothing for a long time. Daniel went back to work 3 weeks after the funeral. He needed the structure. He needed somewhere to put his attention that wasn't the apartment, which felt too big and too quiet, and too full of small things that had been Emma's. He was not, it turned out, at his best. In August 2021, during a routine upgrade of Apex Dynamics' flagship client deployment, a regional power utility in Colorado, a sequencing error caused a 4-hour brownout, affecting roughly 90,000 customers. The error was in a patch written by a junior engineer named Marcus Webb, but Daniel had been the one to sign off on deployment without running the full regression suite. He'd been cutting corners for months, not big corners, just enough to feel like he was keeping pace. Richard Cole, who was VP of engineering, and the kind of manager who collected blame the way other people collected compliments, delivered the finding in a tone that left no room for interpretation. This was Daniel's failure, Daniel's name on the report, Daniel's reputation attached to the incident. The junior engineer's name was mentioned briefly, and then not at all. Daniel contested it, formally, in writing, with documentation, 3 times. The 3rd time, HR advised him that continued contestation was being viewed as an inability to accept accountability, and that his performance review had been adjusted accordingly. He resigned in November 2021. He had a 7-year-old to raise, and a savings account that would last, if he was careful, about 14 months. 14 months later, he was cleaning offices at night, not because it was the only job he could find, exactly, but because the night shift paid more than day shift, because the hours didn't conflict with Sophie's school drop-off, and because nobody asked him to be anything except thorough. he could be thorough without it costing him anything. He'd applied to 11 positions in systems architecture over those 14 months. 3 hadn't replied. 5 had declined after a phone screen. 2 had moved to final interviews and then gone silent. 1 had called back to say they decided to go in a different direction, which was the sentence companies used when they'd found something they didn't like and weren't required to say what. He knew what they'd found. The Apex incident was in every professional search result attached to his name. Not reported inaccurately, just incomplete. Just the part that Cole had put in writing. So he mopped floors. He mopped them thoroughly. Andrew Clark had not slept in 41 hours. This was not entirely unusual for him. Clark was 45, thin in the way of people who forgot to eat when they were thinking hard. And he wore the exhaustion on him like a second jacket, visible but somehow not debilitating. He'd been CTO of Novagrid for 3 years, recruited specifically because of his background in fault-tolerant AI systems, and he'd spent most of that time inside the Helios build. Helios was, depending on who you asked, either the future of decentralized energy management or the most expensive proof of concept in the company's history. The honest answer was that it was both. And that which one it turned out to be would be determined entirely by what happened in the next 6 weeks. The system used a cascading AI model to manage real-time energy distribution across a network of regional substations, dynamically balancing load, predicting demand spikes, and routing power around faults before human operators had even identified them. The technical achievement was genuine. The engineering was, in Clark's assessment, some of the best he'd been part of. But technical achievement and reliable performance at scale were 2 different things. And the gap between them was exactly the territory where reputations were made and destroyed. If Helios worked, if it worked reliably, at scale, without the kind of catastrophic failure that made regulators cancel contracts and journalists write things that reporters then quoted back to boards of directors, it was worth everything they'd put into it. It was worth the 4 years. It was worth the $400 million. It was worth the 3 weekends Clark had missed his daughter's swim meets and the 2 anniversary dinners he'd left early. If it didn't work, in front of the people who would be in the room on February 3rd, then the question of what it had been worth would be answered in a way that no one at this company wanted to hear. The demo was in 6 weeks. 12 major utilities had been invited. 3 sovereign wealth funds had representatives attending. Victoria Stone had personally promised the board a live demonstration under real-world conditions, not a simulation. Not a sandboxed environment with visible guardrails. Real load, real decisions, real time. A fault injection that the system would need to handle without coaching. And for the past 72 hours, Helios had been breaking. Not completely. That would have been cleaner. It was breaking in the specific way that made engineers lose their minds, intermittently, non-reproducibly, in a pattern that kept shifting every time they thought they'd isolated it. The loop error would appear, cascade through 2 subsystems, then resolve, and then reappear 4 to 7 hours later in a slightly different configuration. It was like trying to catch a wave with your hands. Every time they reached for it, it reformed somewhere else. Clark's team of 9 engineers had worked through 3 distinct theories over those 72 hours. The first theory was a hardware fault in the primary load routing module. They'd tested it, found nothing, replaced the module anyway. The error persisted. The second theory was a software race condition in the arbitration stack. They'd traced through 200,000 lines of code, looking for places where 2 processes could be fighting over the same resource. They found 2 such places, resolved them both. The error persisted. The third theory was external interference electromagnetic noise from a nearby construction project affecting the sensors. Clark had almost not included this in his notes because he didn't fully believe it himself, but he'd been awake for 60 hours by that point, and desperation had a way of flattening the hierarchy of hypotheses. By 11 p.m. on December 14th, he'd sent most of them home. Not out of compassion, Clark was not unsentimental, but sentiment rarely drove his operational decisions. Out of diminishing returns, engineers working on 4 hours of sleep made more mistakes than they prevented. They introduced new problems while looking for the old one. They developed convictions about theories they hadn't tested properly, and convictions were worse than uncertainty because at least uncertainty kept you looking. He'd kept Lisa Grant, his most senior engineer, until 10:30 before she'd said simply, "I'll be more useful in the morning." And he'd agreed. He stayed. He always stayed. That was his own failing, maybe the belief that being present at the problem was the same as having a chance at solving it. But he couldn't make himself leave a broken system. It felt like abandonment. At 1:23 a.m., he looked up from his laptop and noticed something he had not been expecting. The board was green. He sat very still for a long moment, the way a person goes still when they encounter something that contradicts their model of reality so completely that they need a second to reconstruct the model before they can respond. Then he pulled up the system logs, found the recovery timestamp 12:01 and 47 seconds a.m., and worked backward through the record, trying to understand what had changed. There was no new deployment in the log. No configuration update. No maintenance flag from any team. No scheduled process that should have triggered at that hour. There was, in the diagnostics buffer log, a small anomaly. A display filter applied to the secondary monitoring terminal at 11:58 p.m. through a read-only panel that facilities management used for HVAC cross-checks. Clark had been working with Helios for 3 years. He understood the system at a level that most of his engineers hadn't reached. He read the anomaly entry 3 times, and on the third reading he began to understand what he was looking at. Someone had used a read-only terminal to interrupt a feedback loop that an entire engineering team, working with full system access, had been unable to even correctly identify for 72 hours. He read it a 4th time. Then he called Victoria Stone. Victoria Stone had been CEO of Novagrid for 6 years. And in that time she had developed a reliable internal sense of when something was important. Not urgent important. The distinction mattered to her. Urgent things demanded immediate reaction. Important things demanded careful attention. Andrew Clark calling her at 2 a.m. was urgent. What he described was important. She was in her office by 6:30 a.m., before most of the engineering team arrived, sitting at the security monitoring station in the building operations center with a cup of coffee and a very particular expression, the one her assistant had learned to recognize as meaning, "Do not interrupt me with anything that isn't a fear." She watched the footage from camera 12, corridor 7C, on the 52nd floor. The timestamp read 11:56 p.m. She watched a man in gray coveralls stop in the middle of pushing a mop cart and look at the monitoring board outside Lab 7C. He stood still for a moment, not long, maybe 9 or 10 seconds. Then he moved to the secondary terminal and typed something. He looked at the board again. Then he picked up his mop and continued down the corridor. The board had turned amber about 12 seconds after he walked away. She watched it again. Then again. The thing that stayed with her, the detail that made this feel different from what she'd initially assumed, a maintenance tech, a lucky coincidence, someone who'd accidentally hit a reset function they didn't understand, was the stillness. The way he had stopped and looked. It wasn't the startled stop of someone who'd noticed something and wasn't sure what to do. It was the settled stop of someone who recognized something, the way a doctor looks at an X-ray, not reading it slowly from corner to corner, but taking in the pattern. He had understood what he was seeing. She set down her coffee. "Find out who this is," she said to the operations manager standing behind her. Today, before anyone else talks to him, Daniel was back on the 52nd floor at 10:47 a.m. He'd been asked to come in early. His supervisor, a man named Gary Stills, who communicated mostly in single-syllable words and had never once asked Daniel about his background, had called him at 9 o'clock and said, in his manner, "Building management wants a word. 52nd floor. Don't worry about it." Gary's tone suggested Daniel should, in fact, worry about it. He took the service elevator and walked into a situation he had not prepared for. The conference room on the 52nd floor was glass-walled, not the internal walls, those were solid, but the wall facing the corridor was floor-to-ceiling glass. He could see, through that glass, 7 people seated around an oval table. 2 he didn't recognize. One was clearly senior operations, the way she was dressed, the way she sat. One was the CTO, whose face Daniel recognized from the company profile he'd looked up 3 months ago when he started. And one was Victoria Stone. He'd looked her up too. He stood in the corridor for 2 seconds, and then a woman in a black blazer opened the door. "Mr. Hayes, please come in." The first 10 minutes were what he expected. A security officer had a laptop with the camera footage loaded. They asked him to identify himself on screen. They asked him to describe, in his own words, what he had done at the monitoring terminal and what prompted him to do it. A woman from legal, who had not been introduced by name, took notes on a yellow legal pad in a handwriting too small to read from where he was sitting. Their tone was professional but guarded, the specific guardedness of people who didn't know yet if this was a problem or a solution and were trying not to commit to either. The framing of the early questions was careful. Did you intend to access any systems beyond your facility's clearance? Did anyone instruct you to interact with the terminal? Have you worked in this building before your current employment with Meridian Cleaning Services? He answered each question directly and without elaboration. Then he told them what he'd seen. He described the timing gap in the process, logged the 17 milliseconds he'd observed in the secondary terminal's timestamp display. He described what a 17 millisecond desynchronization meant in the context of a cascading load balancing model. And he described the feedback mechanism that turned that small gap into a persistent loop error. He was not lecturing. He was answering the question they hadn't asked yet, which was, how would someone like you know any of this? He explained the feedback spiral, using an analogy that came to him naturally, one he'd developed years earlier, when trying to explain the same class of problem to a client who had no engineering background. 2 pipes feeding into a single junction, one running a fraction of pressure ahead of the other. The junction's pressure sensor reads both inputs, notices they disagree by a small amount, and flags the discrepancy as a potential fault. The junction tries to reconcile the readings by cycling its measurement process, but the cycling itself introduces a slight pressure change that alters the readings. And now the discrepancy is slightly different, and the junction cycles again. It doesn't break. It just keeps arguing with itself about something that isn't actually wrong. The system wasn't failing, he said. It was stuck in a confirmation loop. It had 2 accurate readings of its own condition that weren't quite time synchronized, and the logic interpreted the small difference as evidence of a fault, so it restarted the reporting process to confirm. Every restart introduced the same desync, so it confirmed nothing and restarted again. He'd been looking at the table when he said this. He looked up. Andrew Clark was watching him with the particular focus of a person who has been looking for something for a long time and has just heard a sound in the correct direction. "What caused the desync?" Clark asked. His voice was careful, flat, experienced enough not to lead. "An optimization patch," Daniel said. "Added to improve response latency on the primary monitoring feed. Under normal load conditions, the improvement would hold. You'd get a faster feed with no downstream effects. But under high load conditions, the patch moves the monitoring timestamp ahead of the logging process by about 17 milliseconds. Not always. Just when the system is under stress, which is exactly when you're watching the error appear." He paused. "The patch was probably tested under simulated load," he said. "But simulation doesn't always reproduce the specific interaction between subsystems under real peak conditions. The desync only manifests above a certain threshold." Clark reached forward without a word and turned his laptop screen to face the table. On the screen was a deployment log entry. The timestamp read November 7th. The entry description read, "Latency optimization patch, monitoring subsystem 3. The silence in the room had a different quality than it had 3 minutes earlier. Across the table, Lisa Grant, whose expression had been neutral throughout, the careful neutrality of someone deliberately withholding judgment, said, without looking up from the laptop she'd opened beside her, "That's exactly where I would have looked, if I'd been looking there." She said it without bitterness and without performance, just the plain, precise admission of someone who could see, now that it was visible, the thing she'd been standing beside for 72 hours without seeing. There was a kind of professional honesty in it that Daniel recognized and respected. One of the other engineers, a younger man in the back corner who hadn't spoken, said quietly, The high load threshold is why it was intermittent. It only triggered when we were running above 80% capacity. He was talking to no one in particular, just completing a thought out loud. We kept running the reproduction tests at 70% because that was our standard test load. Nobody said anything for a moment. Victoria Stone had not spoken since she'd introduced herself at the start. She had been sitting at the corner of the table where she could see both the screen and Daniel's face. And she had the quality of someone who listened with their full attention, not waiting for a gap to speak, just genuinely receiving. She spoke now. "Mr. Hayes," she said. "What's your background?" He told her. He told it plainly. The way he'd told it many times in his head, but rarely out loud. Rockford, Illinois. University of Illinois Scholarship. 11 years. In systems engineering. Lead engineer at Apex Dynamics. The brownout incident. The formal process that followed. The year and 2 months between his resignation and today, he did not editorialize. He mentioned Emma briefly that he was raising a daughter alone, that the night shift worked with her school schedule. He didn't frame it for sympathy. He mentioned it because it was relevant to how he'd ended up here, and being accurate mattered to him more than being strategic. When he finished, the room was quiet in the way it sometimes got when a story ended before anyone expected it to. Clark said, "The November patch. What would you have done differently?" "Stage the deployment," Daniel said. "Run it in parallel on a shadow monitoring feed for 2 weeks under actual production load. If the timestamp behavior was going to deviate, you'd see it in the shadow data before you committed it to the main feed. We didn't have a shadow feed built into the testing protocol," Clark said. "I know," Daniel said. "I read the deployment logs. You should." Another silence. Not uncomfortable, exactly. More like the particular quiet of people recalibrating. "He's right," Lisa Grant said. Not to anyone specifically. Just aloud. The way facts sometimes needed to be said before they could settle properly. About all of it. They didn't offer him anything that morning. What Victoria Stone did was something more careful. She asked him if he'd be willing to participate in a structured diagnostic session with the engineering team. Paid. At a consulting day rate. No commitments on either side. Just a room, a whiteboard, and a problem. He said yes. The session was held 2 days later, on December 16th, in Lab 7C. The full systems team was there, 9 engineers, Clark and Lisa Grant acting as something between a referee and a translator. Victoria Stone sat in the back of the room and said almost nothing. The problem they gave him was presented cold. A sandboxed version of the Helios routing module, with a seeded fault that the team had introduced themselves and then, in theory, forgotten the specifics of. The room was quiet while he worked. He stood at the main terminal, not sitting, moving slowly along the display while he read the process tree. He didn't ask questions. He asked once for a second monitor so he could compare 2 logs simultaneously, and someone brought one without comment. 7 minutes and 20 seconds after he began, he said, "Here." He pointed to a function nested 4 levels deep in the priority arbitration stack. This is recalculating load priority at a fixed interval, but the interval was hard-coded for a system with fewer nodes. You added nodes in the last expansion and didn't update the constant. So under peak conditions, the priority queue refreshes mid-cycle, and the routing engine is making decisions based on data that's about to be invalidated. He turned to the whiteboard and wrote 11 lines. Not code exactly, pseudocode. The conceptual skeleton of a fix that a real engineer would need 2 hours to implement properly. But the logic was clean. The problem was correctly identified. The solution was proportional to the cause. One of the engineers in the back row said, under her breath, something that the room's acoustics carried further than she'd intended. "Oh, that's elegant." The seeded fault, when Clark revealed it, matched Daniel's identification exactly. Latency, on the sandboxed module, after a preliminary implementation of his suggested fix, dropped by 11%. Nobody clapped. These were engineers. But the room had the specific quality of a room where everyone had just arrived at the same understanding simultaneously. which in its way was more significant. Victoria Stone stood up from her chair in the back and walked to the front of the room. "Thank you," she said to everyone. And then, to Daniel specifically, "Can you stay for 30 minutes? The conference room was smaller this time. Just the three of them. Stone, Clark, and Daniel. Stone didn't waste time. "We want to offer you a position," she said. "Senior Systems Architect. You'd be working directly with Andrew on the Helios deployment and everything that comes after." She named a number. Daniel had not expected the number to be what it was. He kept his expression even. The way he'd trained himself to keep his expression even in rooms like this, because he'd learned a long time ago that showing surprise was sometimes read as revealing the distance between where you were and where the offer was. The number was 11 times what he was currently making. "We want to be direct about why," Stone continued. "This isn't charity and it isn't optics. We're 6 weeks from the most important demonstration this company has ever run. We've spent 4 years and a significant amount of other people's money on a system that I believe in. I need someone who can see what other people miss. You've demonstrated that twice now." Clark nodded slightly. He'd been quiet, but his quiet was attentive. Daniel looked at the table for a moment. Then he said, "I need to ask you something first." Stone gestured. "Go ahead." "The incident at Apex Dynamics in August 2021, he said. "I need that reviewed. Not by you. I'm not asking you to make a judgment. I'm asking that if I take this position, and the incident comes up in any due diligence or background review, that the review is done properly, that the complete documentation is considered, not the version that was reported." Stone was quiet for a moment. Not surprised she had done her due diligence before this meeting, he suspected. More like she was measuring him. "You're saying the record is inaccurate," she said. "I'm saying it's incomplete," he said. "There's a difference. What would a complete record show?" He explained it. Briefly, without editorializing. The junior engineer's patch. His own failure to complete the regression suite. The way the formal process had been shaped afterward. He didn't excuse his part in it. He also didn't accept more than his part. When he finished, Stone was looking at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. "I can't promise you an outcome," she said. "But I can tell you that, before we onboard anyone in a senior technical role, we conduct an employment history review, and we do it thoroughly. If the documentation you're describing exists, our review team will find it." She paused. "Does it exist?" "Yes," he said. "All right," she said. "Then we'll find it." She extended her hand. He shook it. The weeks that followed were not easy, and Daniel would have been suspicious of any version of events in which they were. He started on December 22nd, 3 days before Christmas, which was not ideal timing for anyone. He spent the first 2 days reading documentation, 3 years of architecture decisions, meeting notes, version histories. Clark gave him access and then left him alone with it, which was the right instinct. He read with a highlighter and a notepad. And at the end of the second day, he left a single sheet of notes on Clark's desk. 8 observations, numbered, no commentary. Clark appeared in his office doorway the next morning. "Number 4, he said. "You're right. We argued about that for a week and landed in the wrong place." "I know," Daniel said. "I could tell from the version history. That was, in its compressed way, the beginning of a working relationship. The team took longer. Some of them were welcoming, or at least professionally neutral. Lisa Grant was the first to treat him as a peer, which meant asking him hard questions in technical reviews and not softening them. That was fine. That was what he wanted. A few of them were less comfortable, not hostile, just the specific unease that came from having a problem solved by someone who wasn't supposed to be able to solve it. It disrupted the hierarchy of competence in ways that took time to settle. He didn't push. He did the work. He let the work speak, which was the only language he'd ever been fluent in anyway. The Apex review happened in parallel. Stone's legal team had quietly reached out to the relevant parties in early January, and by the 3rd week of the month, Daniel received a formal letter from Nova Grid's HR department informing him that the employment history review had been completed, that certain materials had been identified as inconsistent with documented event records, and that this finding had been noted in his employment file. It wasn't an exoneration. It wasn't the kind of thing that would appear in news articles or correct search results, but it was something real, something written, something that existed in the world now, as a counter to what Cole had put there. He read the letter 3 times. Then he folded it and put it in the drawer of his desk at work, where Sophie would later find it and not understand what it meant, but recognize from the way he spoke about it that it was important. Richard Cole resigned from Apex Dynamics in February. Though the timing was likely coincidental, Daniel chose not to look into that too closely. The demo was on February 3rd. The amphitheater space on the 58th floor had been reconfigured 3 weeks earlier, its normal furniture replaced with tiered seating for 90, and a technical presentation area at the front, equipped with 4 wall-sized monitoring feeds, a central demonstration console, and a second technical station set off to the right, where the engineering support team would work without being in anyone's sightline. By 8:30 a.m., the room was filling. The utility representatives arrived in groups, most of them in the specific uniform of senior infrastructure people. Practical dress. A kind of focused patience in how they moved, the unhurried manner of people who spent their careers managing things that couldn't be rushed. They came from Texas, the Pacific Northwest, the Mid-Atlantic, New England. They represented, between them, electrical infrastructure serving roughly 40 million people. Some of them had been watching Novagrid for 2 years. Some had been skeptical since the beginning. None of them had come to be polite about it. The Sovereign Wealth Fund observers sat together in the 3rd row, as they had apparently agreed to do in advance. They were quiet and took no notes, which was either a sign of confidence or a sign of having very good memories. Victoria Stone opened the session at 9 a.m. She spoke for 8 minutes, without notes, in the manner of someone who had been carrying this argument for so long that it had become part of her thinking rather than something she had to remember. She did not oversell. She did not use the words revolutionary or transformational, both of which she had instructed her communications team to remove from all materials months earlier. She described Helios plainly, framed the stakes plainly, and then yielded the floor to Andrew Clark. Clark presented the architecture overview in 22 minutes. He was a good technical presenter, clear, unsparing, willing to describe the failures they'd encountered in development alongside the solutions, which was the move that technical audiences trusted most. He was also visibly tired in a way that a night's sleep hadn't completely fixed, and the slight roughness around his composure read in the room as evidence that this had been genuinely hard. Then the system was live. For the first 18 minutes, it performed exactly as documented in the benchmark reports. Load fluctuations handled smoothly. Demand prediction curves tracking within expected margins. The kind of solid, unremarkable operation that was the correct behavior, but didn't make the observers in the room lean forward. Daniel was at the technical station to the right of the main console, watching the system logs on a dual monitor setup. Beside him was Tyler Marsh, who was 26, precise under pressure, and had spent the past 2 weeks learning to work alongside Daniel in the specific way that some engineers learn to function with someone whose thinking they can't quite track but have learned to trust. Anticipate the question, have the tool ready, don't get in the way. The fault injection was introduced at T+1842. The moderator read from a prepared script. We are now injecting a simulated substation failure in the northeastern sector, compounded by a simultaneous demand spike, representing a cold weather peak load event, coinciding with the loss of 2 generating units. This was the test. Not the most extreme scenario the system could face. They'd been deliberately conservative, because the goal was to demonstrate reliable recovery, not heroics, but well within the range of real events that had caused grid operators genuine problems in the past 5 years. Daniel watched the process tree. For 400 milliseconds, the system hesitated. The priority arbitration stack ran its assessment cycle. Demand prediction updated against the new load picture. The routing engine queried the available pathways. Then it moved. Not quickly in any visible, dramatic sense on the wall displays. The change appeared as a series of status updates cascading across the grid model, route indicators shifting, load percentages redistributing. But in the logs, Daniel could see the decision chain. The system had identified 11 viable rerouting pathways, ranked them by efficiency and redundancy, selected the optimal combination, and begun implementing before the fault propagation had even reached the downstream substations. The impact curve, the measure of service degradation across the simulated population, peaked at 2.3% for 48 seconds, then fell smoothly back to baseline. In the old version of Helios, this scenario had triggered the feedback loop 7 times in controlled simulation. In 4 of those 7 runs, the system had been unable to recover without manual intervention. This time, there was no loop. There was no hesitation after the initial assessment. There was the clean, uninterrupted execution of a system doing what it had been designed to do. The room was very quiet. Daniel watched Tyler out of the corner of his eye. Tyler was staring at the wall display, with the expression of someone trying very hard not to smile. From the second row came the sound of a slow, deliberate clap, a single pair of hands, not performative, more like punctuation. And then another pair joined, and then another. And the room found its way to a sustained, genuine applause that had the quality of acknowledgement rather than celebration. Victoria Stone was standing at the front of the room with her back to Daniel's station. He could see, from the angle, the slight change in how she was carrying herself, not a visible expression, just a physical fact. The specific posture of a person whose internal calculus has just shifted from, "we might be all right" to "we are going to be all right." Clark caught Daniel's eye from across the room. He gave a single, minimal nod. The kind of nod that meant something without requiring expansion. The performance report, compiled in the 2 hours after the session, showed the system had achieved 104.2% of its projected benchmark under fault conditions. The impact duration was 38% lower than the documented target. The rerouting decision chain completed in a time that was, frankly, better than anyone had publicly projected. 3 utilities submitted letters of intent within 4 days of the demonstration. The Sovereign Wealth Fund observers, who had said almost nothing during the session, requested a private technical briefing. Clark handled it, with Daniel present. The briefing lasted 2.5 hours. None of this is the part that stayed with Daniel. Sophie came to the office on a Saturday in late February, because she'd asked to see where her father worked and because, after 14 months of mopping office floors while she slept, he felt he owed her this. He didn't take her to his office, which was ordinary. He took her to Lab 7C, which by now had become something almost mythological to him, the fluorescent corridor, the terminal where he'd typed 2 characters and changed the direction of his life. She was small for her age, brown-haired and seriously faced, with her mother's way of looking at things for longer than most people would before deciding what she thought about them. She looked at the monitoring board for a long time. "It's all green," she said. "It is now," he said. "Was it not before?" "It was red for a while." She thought about this. "And you fixed it?" "I helped it fix itself," he said. "There's a difference." She considered that. Then, "Dad. I told Mrs. Albright at school that my dad fixes things that other people can't fix." She said that was a very specific thing to say. "What did you tell her?" "I said it was true." She looked up at him. "Is it true?" He looked at the board. Green across all systems. The Helios model running quietly, managing load flows, rerouting around faults before they cascaded, doing exactly what it had been built to do. "It's getting truer," he said. "There's a version of this story that ends with a speech, or a confrontation, or a number on a check. Those endings are real. The offer was real. The review was real. The demonstration was real. But they're not the part Daniel replayed in his head on the drive home through February cold with Sophie asleep in the back seat, her cheek against the window. What he replayed was the green board. Not because it proved he was right, though it did. Not because it meant the company had validated his value, though it had. But because there was something specific about watching a system recover, watching it find its own balance after a long period of confusion, settle into the behavior it was designed for, and hold that felt like something he recognized. Not triumph. Not even relief. Something older and quieter than either of those. The thing you feel when you've been running at an angle to yourself for years, bending your shape to fit the space you were allowed. And then one day you stop, and stand straight, and discover that you still fit the space you were built for. He'd been a systems engineer for 11 years before he'd lost his way. And the thing about systems, the thing he'd always known and never had to articulate, was that they didn't forget what they were built to do. They just needed the feedback spiral to stop. He pulled off the highway at the Bridgeport exit. Snow was falling again, lighter this time, the kind that melted on the pavement before it could accumulate. Sophie shifted in her seat and didn't wake up. He drove the familiar road home. The Helios contract, signed in April, covered 17 regional utilities across 9 states. The initial deployment was scheduled for Q3 of the same year. Daniel Hayes was named lead architect on the project. The monitoring board on the 52nd floor stayed green.